now we'll dig into our next session, and our final speaker today. Sally Ubnoske is Senior Business Systems Analyst at Ares Systems Corporation. Sally is going to be discussing the NISO MECA Working Group and the project that we've been undertaking to standardize that workflow. So, Sally, you want to draw up your slides?
I would love to, but I think Andrew may need to stop sharing first.
There you go.
Great.
And
there we go. I assume you can see my screen now?
Yep, we can see your screen now and I can hear you.
Great. Well, thank you, Todd, and thank you to NISO and my fellow panelists. A special thank you to Andrew. I feel like I've already had a double introduction, so I appreciate that. I am a business systems analyst at Ares Systems, and as Andrew mentioned, we produce workflow solutions for scholarly publishers. The platform most of you would probably be familiar with is Editorial Manager. We also have a production tracking module called Production Manager. But really today I'm going to talk about the Manuscript Exchange Common Approach project, and we tend to call that MECA. It's a cross-organization industry initiative with a goal of facilitating and standardizing multiple types of manuscript exchange to avoid the loss of data when papers are moved from one system to another. So the first question you might ask is, why transfer manuscripts? And today we've been talking about various concerns regarding the lags for publication, impact on quality, and the challenges that authors and reviewers face in the publishing ecosystem. But I'd like to note that when an author has to resubmit a manuscript that has been rejected at one journal, there is the potential to introduce errors and then delays in the dissemination of research. And of course, that's really the purpose of scholarly publishing. It's really all about authors and reviewers. Authors do tend to become pretty irritated at the time and effort they must spend to resubmit a paper after it's been rejected at one journal and then submit it to another. And researchers, they're faced with so many challenges, and we've talked about some of those today, but the fact that their career progression really depends on the number of publications, the prestige of the journals in which their research is published, and they're under a lot of pressure to publish in high-impact journals to sustain and then further their careers. One article I saw recently mentioned that the U.S. currently has about 40,000 graduates with advanced science and engineering degrees, but U.S. universities only create about 3,000 new full-time positions annually. So the competition for a career in academia is really tough, and publishing is one of the criteria used for getting tenure and just for getting a position at all. So when a paper is rejected, about 85% of researchers do choose to resubmit the rejected paper to another journal. I mean, keep in mind, they've probably invested months or even years performing the research and then writing the paper, so they're not going to give up. But it can be pretty difficult to actually find the right match for a paper. It's not only about the quality of the research and the quality of the paper and whether the results really match with the data, as Mary Elizabeth discussed earlier, but their scope. Is it novel? Is it presenting new information? At the same time, we have the reviewer problem, and I think as Andrew and others have mentioned, finding reviewers is one of the biggest challenges that most editors face. They get irritated. They waste time reviewing papers that either will be rejected or else they have to redo a review of a paper they've already reviewed when it was submitted to a different journal. I saw some interesting article that in 2015, 20% of the biomedical researchers performed between 69 and 94% of the reviews. So that's your basic 80-20 rule. Now, not all papers go through peer review, so you might find that, so certainly the numbers may not be exactly the same. They're not re-reviewing all 85% of the resubmitted papers, but there's still a lot of wasted effort. And if you consider that 85% of those papers are resubmitted to another journal, 20% of the researchers, at least in that domain, biomedical research, are performing 80% of the reviews, the odds are pretty high that the same researchers are asked to repeat the reviews of resubmitted manuscripts, and they may not be even accepted at the second journal. So papers can be submitted at several journals before they find a home. So in peer review, papers can be rejected and they can be resubmitted, but typically the reviews are not submitted and they're not shared between journals. And when another study had calculated when researchers have to redo the reviews of papers they've already reviewed or review papers that will ultimately be rejected, up to 15 million person hours a year is wasted. And since reviewers are such a valued resource, I think that's something that anyone in the scholarly publishing industry would really like to help facilitate a better solution. So as we've seen, publishing is definitely evolving. There's new workflows, there's demands for transfers to and from preprint servers, there are online and collaborative authoring tools, and there's different models of publishing. There's open access, that's been relatively new. Open peer review is another concept that has been people are more aware of over time. But in terms of exchanging manuscripts, each submission system, and editorial manager is an example of a submission system, has to implement a separate exchange mechanism with every other system. And generally, we'd call those a pairwise exchange mechanism. But it's not efficient. It takes a lot of time and effort. If anything changes between the systems, the code must be revised to handle that. So about 2 years ago, John Sack from Highwire Press had the idea of what if we could just come up with a common approach to transfer these submissions between various systems, the papers between different systems. And the goal was really to just get a team of producers and users of manuscript systems to work together in a cooperative way. And that was how the Manuscript Exchange Common Approach project was born. So we're going to talk about what is MECA. It's a method to define how a paper can be exchanged between systems. It's for a system to system, it's to and from preprint servers, to and from vendors. The original team was comprised of ARI systems, and I've had the good fortune to be involved in that original project, so I've been looking at this for a couple of years. Clarivate was involved, eJournal Press, as I mentioned, Highwire Press, and PLOS. But we should also talk about what MECA is not. It's not a central service. It's not a database. It's not any kind of clearinghouse. It is a focus in terms of a non-proprietary open practice and something that anyone can participate in. It is now a NISO working group, and we are working to develop a recommended practice. It is going to be a multi-phase approach, so what we're coming out with coming soon may change over time if we come back and look at it again. But the goal is to improve the quality of the manuscripts, increase the time of publication for research, and improve the experience, really, of authors and reviewers. So as I said, the group was approved in March of 2018, and today we still have the original participants, so that's ARIES, Clarivate, eJournal Press, PLOS, and Highwire Press. But we have additional participants, and they have offered a wealth of knowledge and information and experience from different segments of the industry. So as you can see, we have someone from the American Chemical Society, American Physical Society, Cold Spring Harbor for the bioRxiv preprint server, eLife, IEEE, Green 15, JISC, Journal of Clinical Investigation, National Library of Medicine, Springer Nature, and Taylor and Francis. And everyone has been contributing and has made the original project that much better. When we started the project, the initial group and then the NISO working group really spent time thinking about the organizing principles for the project. Primary among those principles is the fact that journals and authors set the rules on what is transferred, not MECA. It's a seamless transfer between publications and platforms, where the goal is not necessarily to send a complete submission, but rather to send the data required to create a record and to start a submission on the receiving site. We focus on defining a minimal set of required data. As I said, we really need to be able to create a record on the receiving site, and the receiving site has to figure that out and have their own processes. But if we standardize on what the data that's transferred is expected to look like, what the files look like, it's easier for each receiving site to figure out what to do with it once it receives the package, and for the senders to know what to send out. We focused on a minimal viable product, starting with phase 1, but we do want to build room for growth in terms of future use cases. We're really focused on best practices and industry standards. So, for example, we will include some of the standard identifiers like ORCID and Ringgold and so forth. We also wanted to make sure there are low barriers of entry to use MECA. So not every organization in publishing has a huge engineering staff. If we define a standard based on common tools and common standards, then there's place for everyone to participate. We are coming up with a recommendation. It's not going to be a NISO standard, it's going to be a NISO Recommended Practice. There's no central hub. We're not talking about software or a service. And unlike Crossref or ORCID, we're not going to trace a manuscript. And this was one of the things that we talked about in great depth in the initial group. So if a paper is transferred from one journal to another and then onto another journal, we're not tracking the history. The author has the right to submit a paper at a journal as if it was the first time. So, as in all projects, it's usually helpful to first look at the use cases. What problems are we trying to solve? And we have four use cases. 3 fall into the primary category and 1 secondary use case. So submission system to submission system, that's probably the one we think of first. So if it's going from editorial manager to eJournal Press or to Scholar One or to Bench Press or Highwire Press, the package, it should be able to be transferred using the same package. We are looking at preprint servers to and from, because so often now authors are often submitting to preprint servers to get a first cut at some comments. And then they might like to take that paper and use from the preprint server, like bioRxiv, and submit it to the journal of their choice. So we have to have a way to exchange the manuscript to and from the preprint servers. There's also been a growth in terms of authoring tools and collaborative authoring systems, and having a way to exchange manuscripts between those front-end tools and the submission system is another primary use case. And then finally, we are also looking at to and from various services, production platforms, hosting platforms. We defined 8 project areas, and I will talk about each of these in a little more detail. Starting with vocabulary, defining a shared nomenclature ensures that there's a baseline for understanding. We really fleshed out the use cases and included additional terms. We currently have more than 70 terms in a spreadsheet that we're maintaining. It will be updated over time, and we're including the term, an agreed upon definition, synonyms, other terms that may be confused with, some alternatives, and some examples. For packaging, we needed to find a way to assemble the files. How are we going to ship the submission between systems? We settled on using a zip package. It's a common method. People are familiar with that, and it's a commonly used way of sending files between systems. We are including 1 manuscript per zip file. So that is going to be part of the recommended practice. So any one zip package contains various XML files and any source files, annotated reviews, things of that nature. They all belong in the same zip package. We have 4 XML files that can be included. There's a manifest XML file, and then there's the transfer XML file. Those are both new DTDs. I know that Andrew talked about JATS. That's one kind of a DTD. But JATS didn't really work very well for us for the manifest or the transfer. but we are using the article XML will be represented in JATS XML. And probably the part that has gotten people most excited is that we will be able to optionally include a reviews XML. And then, as I mentioned, any of the source files associated with the submission. And when I say source files, it would not necessarily only be the files the author uploaded to create their submission. It might be alternative versions of a file. So you might have a thumbnail and a high-resolution image. You might have a marked up file that a reviewer had a comment in. So it can be other files besides just what the author uploaded. I'm going to start with the manifest. And the goal here is to define how do we pass file information from system to system. When the zip package lands on an FTP server at the receiving site, the receiving system has to understand what the files are and how to deal with them. So we do that through the manifest. It's a list of the files and some information, more detail about those particular files. So the receiving system knows what to do with them. So every file that's included in the zip package must have an entry in the manifest file. But you can also have additional entries in the manifest file that don't represent a physical file. So an example would be if you have just a link to a web page or a link to a data set, and that's included as part of the submission, but you're not bringing the whole file in, just a reference. We are also including some optional attributes about the type, submission item ID, MIME type, and so forth. But the receiving system, as I said, needs to figure out what to do with those files once they land on their FTP server. And since I'm just so grateful to Andrew, this is not the first DTD you've seen this afternoon, so I'm not going to go through this line by line. It's pretty much looks like many other DTDs. We are pulling in parts of JATS because we want to make sure that none of the custom DTDs conflict with the JATS compatibility model. We are pulling in the special characters module from JATS, and as you can see, we've worked out some of, basically the elements. I will tell you that this sample DTD is from the original project group. The NISO Working Group is reviewing and changing the details, so the final recommended practice will differ from this DTD. But here is a sample XML file for the manifest. And I have a blue arrow just pointing out one of the items. So this is a figure. We do have the ability to include some custom metadata ID. That's just an XML ID. It can be used to identify files that may have different text names for the submission item, but they represent the same idea, the same object. This is a figure. We can show some file order. We can include some other metadata, so you can see I have a caption and a figure number for this element. And we just really need some kind of an item for every file. So next I'm going to talk about the transfer XML and the transfer DTD. So the object of the transfer XML is to really just to pass transfer information from system to system about the source and the sender of the package and the destination or the recipient of the package. So this DTD includes information about the service provider. It'll have the contact information, the publication type, title, and acronym. There's some optional ability to have an authentication code for some security. And there's built in a way to include some processing instructions. And here's the DTD. Again, you'll see that we pulled in the special characters module from the JATS DTD. And we're just providing information for the source and the destination. All right, this is a sample transfer XML. So the left blue arrow points out that we have information about the source. What is the provider name? So this is an example of a submission that's being transferred from an eJournal Press journal. We have some contact information, and we can tell that it's a journal. That's the publication type. And on the right-hand side, the top right arrow shows the destination information. And we also have some processing instructions that are not necessarily, they don't need to be validated by the DTD, they're just there for further instructions. So the article XML is JATS compliant, and that's really important because that is the standard for publishing. MECA is using the green DTD, that's the Journal Archiving and Interchange DTD for the article metadata. We chose the green DTD, it's more forgiving than the alternative, which would be the blue Journal Publishing DTD. And I want to point out that the article XML should represent the submission as it was at the highest revision level in the sending site. So we don't want a whole history of all the different revision levels. It should just be the highest revision level of the submission as it was before it was sent out from that original system. We do have some minimal required data. We're looking for some kind of article identifier, article title, and a corresponding author. And you can have other metadata, that's optional. You could have information about related articles, funding information, any custom metadata, and so forth. And because in JATS we can include figures, tables, and supplementary materials, that would also be included. Now this is a somewhat collapsed version of the article XML because, as you can imagine, these XML files are pretty large. I'm just pointing out that this is a manuscript identifier is included, an article title is included, and we are using the contrib group to list all the authors. And you can see a little further down, we do have room for funding information. Anything that's supported in JATS would also be supported in the article XML. But as I mentioned earlier, one of the more interesting aspects of MECA is the ability to include reviews in the transfer package. Typically, most transferred submissions did not include reviews. We handle this in the reviews XML file. We have a way to tag various review items, so you can have questions and responses, ratings, comments, annotations, red lines, and marked up files. We are trying to make sure we've modeled all possible review components that would ever need to be sent. But the one part that is really important to highlight is that the privacy is handled by the sending system. So whether a review is even included in a reviews XML file or if the reviewer is identified is going to be based on the sending site's policies. And I'll just give you a little example. So in Editorial Manager, we will not export a review or a reviewer's name and any of their identifying information unless they have explicitly agreed for that submission. Now, you'll notice the last bullet says multiple reviews and revisions can be in one file. So this is going to be a large XML file. Remember, the article XML, we said, was just going to be the highest revision level of the submission. But reviews, as anyone that's worked in peer review publishing knows that oftentimes the most valid and most relevant reviews are handled at the original submission level. And as the paper goes through several reviews, the reviews may not be as meaningful, or several different revisions, and as an author gets a revised decision, submits a revision. As it goes forward, the reviews may not be as meaningful. So the reviews XML will contain all reviews that are relevant for that submission. It'll include reviews from from as many reviewers who agreed, and if those reviewers agreed to submit reviews for multiple revisions, that would also be included. So the reviews DTD, this is basically what we had out of the original group. In fact, the NISO Working Group met about a week and a half ago to go through and revise this. So there were a few issues on the reviews DTD, which is, as I said, a custom DTD. To make sure, we had to make some changes to make sure that it's actually does not conflict with JATS. It's not JATS compliant because it's not a JATS DTD, but we don't want anything in here that is a misrepresentation of how the JATS tag would work. So this is just a little snippet of a reviews XML file. What I'm trying to point out here is we have a review for the version 1. And actually that's one of the tags we had to change. So it's a review version, not just version. We have it for revision 0 and revision 1. And that way you can see that we can gather up all the different reviews that are relevant for that submission. We're again using contrib group where we can use the JATS tags in a way that makes sense. We are doing so. So a surprisingly interesting problem was, how do you identify the package? We needed a unique and consistent way to identify a paper across systems. We needed a unique identifier, because we have to identify that zip package. When it lands on the FTP server, it has to be unique to that package, and it can't have anything that's relevant to the sending site. So we can't have an article number or a manuscript number, because that would be relevant to the sending site journal. So we looked at DOIs, but that doesn't really work because the prefix is usually, you can tie it to a source. We finally settled on a unique, a universally unique identifier known as a UUID. Many coding libraries support this. We chose to use the type 1 UUID. It involves time and the machine's address and a random number, so that the idea is the odds of any kind of a conflict or having a duplicate identifier is pretty much 0. Transmission was another area that initially, because we were looking for low barriers to entry, when we want something that people can implement without too much pain and without a large engineering staff, and most publishing groups have some kind of a way to use FTP. So we're using secure FTP for phase 1. So NISO Working Group, though, we did talk a lot about having an API. And as you can see, the phase 1, we're looking at XML and secure FTP. There is potential in the future to look at using an API and maybe even allowing JSON. But with a recommended practice, you really need to settle on one or the other. So to get started, we're focusing on the actual FTP, secure FTP. And I would say that if we have the opportunity to come back and revisit the standard, we would then explore the options for an API and using JSON possibly. So, as you can see, this has been a busy group. As we started that original MECA group back in 2017, we basically had various members of the group present at various conferences: JAPSCon, CASRAE, SSP, OASPA, Force 11, STM, ISMTE, and so forth. We've talked with authoring platforms, composition vendors, preprint servers, tried to gather all this information from the various parties. We created a web page, and we had a general informational webinar. Also, some of the members have come up with some trial or reference implementations. We do, at Aries, editorial manager does have a MECA import and a MECA export, but we expect that we will have to make some changes once the NISO Recommended Practice comes out. So this year has been, we focused on, in 2018, we expanded the working group. We had it approved as a NISO working group. And as you can see, we had so many wonderful participants that have really enhanced the whole project. And we are close to wrapping up the project. We are working now on going through all the notes, making sure that we have agreement on any of the major issues. We will be developing a draft, and then following the standard NISO working group practice, it will go around for review within our group. It'll go out for comments to the NISO membership, and eventually it will receive a vote to see if it's approved. There is additional information. As I said, MECA has a web page, and there are different webinars and so forth that you can see there. We also have a NISO web page for the MECA project, and we have an email address. So thank you very much. I know that was a whirlwind of information, but I feel like it was a great conclusion when we looked at Mary Elizabeth about all of the work that goes into, from an editorial perspective, on gathering reviews, and eventually the paper sometimes has to be rejected or transferred. So taking it from there, and we can talk about the different ways of dealing with XML and DTDs and open access, it all ties together. So I'm happy to take some questions now.
All right, great. Thank you, Sally. And in terms of, I know you mentioned 2019, any thoughts from, I know this isn't entirely up to you, but any thoughts about when that recommendation will be published?
Well, I I would like to see it soon. It's been a big project. We do have a first draft, and so we didn't start from scratch, which has been really helpful. And I think the whole working group would have taken much longer if we had to start from scratch. So we had a draft, and we had a year's worth of work from that original working group. So we have the draft, and now we need to go back, and as I said, we just met with the reviews XML subgroup and needed to make some changes. We have Laura Randall from National Library is helping us with, she's a real JAS expert, so that's been helpful, and various people will be offering additional comments and ideas. So once I'm going to say fourth quarter, and that's just a guess right now.
Sure. Year end.
Yeah. I'm just hoping before the end of 2019. I don't know if I can take this into another year, so.
Yeah, no. The process always takes a little bit longer than people always expect, but many thanks to you all. You and the entire committee have been doing a great job, not only about technical work, but also building awareness around the project. So thank you for that.
Great, thank you.